Okay, Pocky, I apologize. We're good to go now.
Okay, thank you. Welcome again, and we're ready to call the CAC Transit Element Subcommittee meeting to order. After the last meeting on February 28th, we followed up with all of the transit working group members to get some answers to some questions about your costs. Thank you to all of you who responded. As a reminder, what we wanted to know was what portion of the proposed investments would be for continuing the current RTA funded service enhancements that have been implemented from 2006 to 2026. We also wanted to know from you what portion of the proposed investments would be used for new or additional service enhancements. And then our third question was, in your view, how would the proposed level of investments in each sub-element help to meet anticipated service needs for the next 20 years? So again, we had a deadline of March 15, and thank you again to those jurisdictions that responded. So what I wanted to do today for this agenda item, this next agenda item, is to, let's see, my mouse isn't moving, is to call on the jurisdictions that responded. There we go. To call on the jurisdictions that responded and to get additional information. And again, the purpose of this exercise was to give the CAC Transit Element Subcommittee members an opportunity to hear from you and to help them assess the transit element funding allocations. So with that, if everyone's good with that, I'd like to start with the City of Tucson to talk about your investments and what you would like to share with the sub-element. And I believe Rhett Crowninshield and Steve Spade and James Castaneda are available to have that discussion. So Rhett, James, and Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Actually, so those of you who know me, my name is Rhett Crowninshield. I'm the transit administrator for the City of Tucson. I'll have James Castaneda with me. He's the transit services manager. I also actually have Patrick Hartley, who is one of our senior planning managers, and he's going to walk through the elements from Move Tucson, and then we'll finish with the specific transit piece and kind of what our asks are as well. Do you all have access to the presentation that we put together?
I did receive it, Rhett. I believe Crystal, I'm not sure if you're able to pull it up. If not, I know that you said you would have it available to pull up, Rhett.
Yes, we will pull that up. Hold on one second. I apologize. We use Teams most. We're not always using Zoom when we walk through presentations. So I'm going to see if I can pull that up or if James can pull that up. Okay. Hopefully you can all see this.
Yes. There you go. Thank you so much, Rhett, for pulling that up. We can see it. I don't know if you'd like to put it in video mode or I'm
going to put it into the slideshow.
Yep, there you go.
And with that, we're going to start off with Patrick Hartley's piece, and away we go.
Thank you, Rhett. Thank you,
Just
members.
for your information, we do see, sorry, Patrick, we do see
go ahead.
Screens. No, I mean, we see two screens on our end. I don't know if you can pull it on just to have one. I think we see your notes page, unless that's what you need.
Let me see what I can do.
No worries if you can. I just wanted you to be aware.
I don't think notes. I think it might be the next slide coming up.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah, let me see if I can get that out of the way. How about now?
There you go. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Pocky, we ready to go?
I'm ready to go, Patrick. Thank you.
I'm ready to go too. Thank you, Pocky. Thank you, Rhett. Thank you, members of the Citizens Advisory Committee Task Force Subcommittee for allowing us to give a brief presentation over some of Tucson's transit needs, kind of how we've incorporated that perspective into Move Tucson and how we're using that to really identify our future investment strategy. So we've got a multi-part presentation laying the foundation and the framework through Move Tucson, and then a little bit more information on some of the initiatives that are underway in terms of identifying Tucson's transit needs. So for those of you who might be less familiar, Tucson, Move Tucson was the city of Tucson's long-range transportation plan that we completed in 2021. And essentially, it kind of mirrors some of the work that's been happening at the regional level in terms of identifying the overall transportation needs in the city of Tucson, kind of coming up with a cost estimate of that based on both capital projects and systemic needs or kind of non-locational projects, and then identifying a methodology for prioritizing those investments and identifying a funding amount or investing amount that would be kind of an ambitious yet reasonable target over the 20-year horizon of Move Tucson. So what you see on your screen right now is our initial pass at identifying overall citywide needs on an annualized basis. So basically through the Move Tucson plan, identified about $13 billion in potential needed investment within the city of Tucson. And a lot of that was drawing from both new projects that we identified through the Move Tucson process, but also incorporating a lot of our modal planning activities, including some of the long-range transit planning activities that have been happening at a regional level. So we identified kind of these 10 cost categories for improvements in the city. And you notice that the largest and top bar on that list is the public transportation service improvements. And this is $265 million. So again, this is a need analysis. This wasn't necessarily what our investment strategy was for Move Tucson, which we could move into. But essentially, that 265 was the number that was identified for if we fully implemented the long-range regional transportation plan service improvements over the 20-year Move Tucson horizon, including the kind of the rollout schedule, some of the complementary capital investments that went along with those service improvements. We're at the frequent transit network, the weekend service, the evening service. Our baseline is about $100 and $110 million invested in our transit operations currently. So this would be about a 2.5-fold increase to fully implement the long-range regional transit plan. The second item on that bar graph also relates to transit, and this is the high-capacity transit projects. And again, at a need level, we were identifying about $164 million per year annualized. Now, it's not to say that we would incrementally fund a capital investment in high capacity transit at $164 million a year. It was rather taking the overall need and annualizing it over those 20 years. And then we've got a number of other project categories that are more related to kind of some of the other elements of RTA next that they're discussing and some of the capital investments. But the two top lines are really most relevant, I think, to this subcommittee. Rhett, can you advance the slide, please? So if we go look at that then, in terms of what we fully anticipated or ambitiously wanted to invest in over the horizon of Move Tucson plan, again, 20 years, we took those 10 categories and broke them down into 7 categories or condensed them. Ultimately reduced what our funding target was from $13 billion in need to $7 billion in potential investment and an ambitious investment over the 20-year horizon. So the yellow bars represent our current funding level on our base budget when we developed Tucson, which was 2019. The purple bar on top is kind of the gap that we want to close to invest in a target that is consistent with the Move Tucson goals and outcomes that we identified. So if you look at the first one, basically, we're currently investing about $100 million in capital improvements or named projects. And this includes everything from bike boulevards to major corridor projects, all of our existing funding sources, local funding, existing regional funding through the RTA. And so the projects are moving forward. our kind of ambitious target for Move Tucson was to increase that investment in capital improvements by about 48% over baseline. Rhett, you want to advance? I think, yeah, there's an animation. Worked. Thank goodness. So I want to focus on this one a little bit before we get into the operational element. I think comparing this to the structure of what we've seen for RTA Next, we've actually put our high capacity transit projects, our streetcar and bus rapid transit, in our location specific project element, which is pretty similar to more the kind of named project or roadway element of RTA Next. It's defined locations, a description of the project intent, and termini, as opposed to the other categories on this list, which are largely systemic improvements, but don't necessarily have specific locations identified for our long range plan. So we identified about 250 or thereabouts projects in Move Tucson under that location specific network improvements. A subset of those that were high priority, we forwarded along for consideration in RTA Next, including our 2 high capacity transit corridors that we identified. Next slide, Rhett. So as I mentioned, we had about 250 projects that we identified in Move Tucson. And again, this is our universe of projects, potential investment, not saying that we're going to deliver on all of these in the next 20 years. Within those, we identified 8 high capacity transit projects, which were both a combination of the technology, be it bus rapid transit or streetcar, and the location. The purple on your screen is the higher priority. So they are organized into tier 1, 2, and 3. Purple being the highest priority projects or tier 1. And that is kind of that north-south spine, excuse me, that north-south spine that you may have been seeing on some of our materials. We're there with the Tucson Norte sewer process right now, kind of looking at complementary land uses on this corridor. And that's really connecting the 2 or the 3 transit centers with high capacity transit. The tier 2 projects are kind of backburnered for now. Those aren't ones that we're advancing into RTA Next, but are still on our list of universe of potential projects. One thing I do want to point out about kind of that north-south corridor, which is running through downtown, essentially from the airport through downtown up into the Tohono Tadai Center, is that there are actually 2 investments on each of those locations. So it's a little hard to see, but they are overlapping bus rapid transit and streetcar projects. And the intention here with Move Tucson was not to necessarily select a single one of those corridors, but really to advance the cost of those together, assuming then that we would advance into additional analyses, community outreach, financial assumptions to identify which of those we could really reasonably move forward. So we have overlapping streetcar and BRT on both of those corridors. Go ahead, Rhett.
Just real quick, Patrick, we've got a question from one of the members.
Yeah.
Got a couple questions. Carolyn, do you want to start? And then we'll go to our next member question.
Sure, I've got a lot of questions eventually, but I'll wait. But you were talking about the overlapping, Patrick, thank you. The overlapping transit and high capacity, and I see that purple going north has a smaller dotted purple and a bolder, a larger, the dotted lines that are going up north. What does that mean? Are both of them high capacity transit? And I don't understand what the 2 dotted lines are and the difference between the 2 and their sizes and boldness, I guess. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you. Good question, Carolyn. So the kind of the dashed line or the long line are the bus rapid transit, and the shorter dotted line are the streetcar alignment. Now, heading south, they're directly overlapping. I do want to emphasize that these corridors at this time are still very much conceptual. That's kind of the general area where we're looking at, but we are going to do additional analysis to identify a specific alignment kind of within a 1/4 to 1/2 mile corridor of this spine. And that's something we're undertaking with ETOD right now. And it's something we're going to continue undertaking with additional capital planning. I can talk a little bit more about in a moment. If you look at the northern piece of that, you see there is a divergence. So the bus rapid transit is actually running north along Oracle, whereas the streetcar is running north along Stone. And if you want to know the foundation of these routes, these largely are taken from the high capacity transit study, which we've rolled into Move Tucson. That was part of an appendix to the long range regional transit plan. So these have been kind of evaluated at a regional scale already. We need to do additional work to identify the feasibility and kind of preferred alignments, but that's the foundation we are laying. With regard to the northern extent in particular, we still have to make a determination whether the preferred alignment, I think, would be Stone or Oracle. That decision has not been made, and that is actually reflected in the project description of this HCT corridor that was submitted to RTA next. So it's more of a Stone or Oracle and south to the airport, but we are kind of looking for some flexibility there because we know there is initial investigation and analysis that need to occur. In particular, we are just initiating, looking at potential federal grant funding for these corridors. And part of that grant funding will be basically coming up with our locally preferred alternative in terms of phasing the projects in. Do we want to bite off the full 15 or 14 mile corridor out of the gate, or do we look at a smaller element of that is more kind of feasible and more immediately deliverable? And are these the appropriate alignment? So those are questions that are yet unresolved, but this is kind of where we are right now, building on the HCT study, building on the long range regional transit plan, and elevating that through Move Tucson. There's a lot of words. Was that answering your question, Carolyn?
Well, it does. And one follow-up question, and then I'll wait on the rest. But that is the follow-up study and the alignment selection going to be within the time frame of finalizing the RTA plan?
You know, we're just kicking that off now. I think we're looking at probably a couple of years before we get that totally finalized. So I think there's going to be discussion in terms of how do we frame this within RTA next, in the same way that there was a lot of unknowns in RTA 1 with streetcar. There was a general location and alignment identified, but there were still some deviations that occurred on that through that study. I think we would expect to see something similar with this. So I think it'll be important to capture it in a way that reflects the intent of kind of this north-south spine, but does allow or provide enough flexibility to a partner through the federal process and advance the project in a phasing that makes sense.
Okay, thanks.
Patrick, I think, I don't know how, oh, thanks, Rhett. Thanks for jumping in. I couldn't see the hands earlier, so I appreciate you helping me facilitate, Rhett. Is Josue still had a question? Josue, are you still wanting to ask something?
Hi. Yeah, no, it's okay. I think the conversation went into more or less what I was going to ask. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I don't see anyone else, Rhett, do you?
Nope.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks all. All right, we can advance, Rhett. Oops. I got ahead of my animations.
Yep, my fault.
So I think many of you should probably be familiar with this. Then this is how we translated that into the submission to RTA next. So there was that request for projects for $600 million in named projects for the jurisdiction. And it was kind of under this request, the City of Tucson submitted 2 high capacity transit projects. Essentially, again, following that same north-south spine of the Move Tucson Tier 1 high capacity transit corridors that we just discussed. So it's project number 3660 and 3661. You'll notice under both of those, again, that the descriptions are not specific to technology. Again, we're thinking about that flexibility and what the opportunities are and what, you know, as we engage with our federal, potential federal opportunities. So it does just specify a high capacity transit corridor from downtown to the airport on 6th Avenue. Now, again, this might be subject to change, but it doesn't specify whether it's a BRT or a streetcar. However, I will point out that we did submit the cost at $82 million, which was consistent with our understanding at the time, which came out of the high capacity transit study of the cost of operating that streetcar line, essentially. And then northbound, again, the description isn't specific to the technology. It also is not specific to the corridor. So it says Oracle/Stone high capacity transit project, again, recognizing that we're looking and evaluating either of those alternatives, and at $56 million. Even since we've done this, the cost of BRT, so this is kind of our BRT best guess estimate, is now increased again. I'm sure, as all of you are aware, and have been hearing, there's a lot of volatility in the market right now. Costs are all over the place. We're seeing insane increases. Our best guess estimate right now for BRT is about $25 million per mile. If we look at streetcar, that's about $100 million per mile. That's just back of the envelope, kind of what we're seeing nationally. It's our working assumption for it. So I think there might be some discussion as to kind of how we would want to advance this. We recognize that there's some discussion happening in this committee on how they get incorporated into the transit sub-elements. It looks like a lot of what was already placed in there is primarily operationally focused. These came out of the named project list, so I think that's a discussion for you all. But just so you know that that's kind of where we were at with our working assumption and kind of what those costs were. Chances are we would need to be looking at federal funding as a complement to actually deliver these projects. And again, I think we're going to be looking at phasing within that broader corridor and maybe potentially different alignments. But you should have this in front of you as a member of this committee. Go ahead, Rhett. And give me one more, because I know there's an animation here. Yeah. The other piece of this is, so that was the capital element. That's how we handled that under Move Tucson. There's also the operational element. So our baseline assumption for Move Tucson, and this was current at the time, was about $93 million annual to operate our transit system through Suntran. Incorporating, I think we're now about over 100 million. The Move Tucson recommendation was basically built around the medium-term recommendations from the long-range regional transit plan. So I think that's been shared with all of you. I'm not entirely sure. But in order to basically implement the long-range regional transit plan, which is our operating assumption under Move Tucson, which included rolling out the frequent transit network, your weekend and evening service, and some of the capital enhancements that were there to be transit supportive, including additional buses needed to operate more frequent service, some improvements at intersections, as well as bus stop improvements. We estimated the need to be about a 49% increase over our baseline to fully implement and sustain the medium-term recommendations of the long-range regional transit plan over the 20-year horizon of Move Tucson. And we were focused specifically on those, services that would be implemented by Tucson Transit. Next slide, Rhett. And in case you're not familiar with it, this is just a brief overview again of what the medium-term recommendations from the long-range regional transit plan were. Again, it was focusing on the frequent transit network, which are the 10 to 15 minute headways, kind of that core service, the areas identified in red, providing weekend service that basically mirrored what we were providing on the weekdays, and then providing additional service, additional frequency after 7 p.m. at night for people who worked irregular hours. So that was our working assumption. We rolled that into Move Tucson. It was kind of the backbone of the transit system that we were assuming in the cost estimate. So we were estimating about $47 million in additional investment within the system annually to be able to deliver on that frequent transit network.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
What do you expect will be the increase in usage and ridership by the increase in service?
Rhett, James, do you guys have an answer to that?
Hi, Mel. It depends on the route. What we've seen with our, it depends, again, going back to the route. What we've seen on the current Sunlink ridership initially started out very high, and then it leveled off, and it's since broken records with ridership. A lot of that is due to our but it depends on the route. If there's a specific route that you've got in mind, we can take a closer look at that.
Well, I don't know enough about specific routes, but if we're going to invest $47 million a year, it'd be nice to know which routes you think will respond and which will not, so that maybe it's a more focused investment.
Understood. We'll address some of that later on in this presentation related to the COA that we're currently conducting. I expect that to inform us and to give you a better idea moving forward. And we're happy to come back and provide more as it relates to that and to how we would envision unrolling this plan.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And just one more quick mention. There are two other things I just want to bring up about this. So the medium term was for 10 years. Move Tucson was a 20-year horizon. So essentially what we did is we just extended the cost of operating the system an additional 10 years, assuming that the new services would be rolled out in the first 10 years, but then we would have the ongoing maintenance costs or the operational costs of the system over the following 10 years. So it looks a little different than the long-range regional transit plan. One other way we did use this and incorporate it into Move Tucson is we did a prioritization of those 250 projects that were identified as being on the future frequent transit network received additional points because we wanted to target some of our capital investments for, pedestrian improvements, safety improvements, bike improvements, where we're seeing that transit ridership. So you're providing that connectivity as well, instead of doing those things kind of separate from each other. So it informed the capital projects, but it was also part of our kind of systemic need analysis that we conducted under Move Tucson. And next slide. All right, well, I think that is it for me. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. James Castaneda is going to walk us through the next 3 slides, but I wanted to reiterate some of the key points that Patrick hit on. Inflation has been endemic. Our fuel costs have risen, our labor costs have risen, and the amount of money that's programmed prior is not far. I know we've seen that in other parts of RTA, but that's a key point that I hope you all take away today. And James?
Thank you, Rhett. Thank you, committee members. So I'd like to go back to the question that Paki closed at the opening of this presentation. So you're about to see now is our best analysis to answer a few questions which was posed by this committee at the February 2018. The first of that is, what portion of the proposed investments will be for continuing current RTA funded service enhancements that have been implemented for 2006-2026? The second being, what portion of the proposed investments may be used for additional or new service enhancements? And lastly, the city view on if the proposed level of investments would help meet anticipated service needs moving forward. So in order to answer those questions, city staff closely with Tran, and the methodology you're seeing on your screen there is kind of the step-by-step approach we took to answer those questions. So beginning, we look at current transit elements, and we used upcoming fiscal year dollars to try and project how much the annualized current service is going to cost in 2024. So that'd be starting July 1st of this year. Next, we extrapolated those values for the entirety of the 20-year RTA Next program. From that information, we were able to estimate both how much would be spent throughout the duration of RTA Next for existing service. Now, that would be City of Tucson services. So it would not include Sun Shuttle or Sun Shuttle dial programs overseen by the RTA. And then finally, we did add some additional considerations for inclusion in RTA Next, just for discussionary purposes. Those relate to an increase in our neighborhood urban circulator program, as well as some ongoing funding for the maintenance operation of our Sun Sunlink streetcar, which is approaching 10 years old. So we will be needing to focus some maintenance responsibility system. And so if you could please advance the slide, Rhett. You will now be seeing the table we put here. So each line item represents a transit service element. So for instance, weekend, evening bus services, bus frequency, express service, etc., are itemized on the top portion of the table you're seeing. And then we have both a nation of the total cost spent estimated throughout the duration of the 20-year RTA Next program, as well as a remaining amount is based on the $510 million figure that was the proposed investment for the transit element within RTA Next. And then that portion of the table you're seeing under additional considerations, that's the portion, those two line items speak to the Sunlink streetcar operation needs, as well as increase in urban neighborhood circulators for our bus system. So the summation we have highlighted in the two boxes that have kind of the outline. We estimate that about $277 million is the amount that it will take to continue current service provisions throughout the RTA Next program. Again, these are focused on city, the services that are under city purview, not counting the Sun Shuttle and Sun Shuttle Ride services. So with that, the remaining amount for additional service enhancements would be about $233 million, or about 4% of the total RTA Next budget. If we could please advance the slide, Rhett. So here in key takeaway, I would like to let the committee know that we did work an additional scenario using an inflator. So as Rhett and Pat mentioned, the operation costs for transit, we have seen a huge increase that is outpacing the revenues we're receiving. So we do have that data available. Committee members wish to see. But the key takeaways, again, I'll just reiterate the bolded cells from the previous slide. We estimate about $277 million is a cost to run current services through RTA Next, leaving about $233 million for new or additional service enhanced. And based on these estimates, we feel that there is not sufficient funding allocated to meet anticipated service needs over the course of RTA Next. Based on our Move Tucson projects, this would only cover about 20 to 25% of the transit identified within the Move Tucson program. Next slide, please. In closing, I'm going to pivot a little bit. As Rhett mentioned, the transit system is currently undergoing a comprehensive operational analysis, which includes our SunTran, Sunlink, SunExpress, and Sun Shuttle operations. And just to speak briefly on this comprehensive operational analysis, it's going to look at all aspects of existing transit service, try and identify any inefficiencies, and work those in as recommended improvements moving forward. So really the goals of the COA are to identify opportunities to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, and equity of our current options, enhance the transit system to better support the needs of the community, and propose recommendations for future changes or expansions. In terms of the timeline, we have already completed the data collection and review of existing conditions. We are at the tail end of our first round of public engagement, which has really been going out to the public and soliciting information on what they would like to see within our current transit service provision. From there, we will be prioritizing based on the public input we receive and developing guiding principles, and also in tandem with that, working on draft service recommendations. After that, we will be going out once again to the public once those draft service recommendations have been made to get their input on what those recommendations are. We anticipate that next round of public engagement will begin here towards the end of May, moving into June. And after that, we will be coming back with final service recommendations toward the end of summer, early fall. To go back to Mel's question, in terms of the comprehensive operational analysis, This will identify or help us identify those routes that are currently underperforming, and maybe tweak or adjust those routes as needed to help them perform better. Additionally, we will be looking at the system holistically and comparing that to the recommendations coming out of the long range plans to make sure those plans mesh well with each other. And I believe that is the final that we have. We are welcome to any questions you may have regarding any of the information you've just seen. Thank you.
Hi, it's Mel. I have another question. For in that graph for the express service, or the rapid, I guess it's the express service. I'm not understanding. Do we know how many people are currently using it? And what expectation do we have that that is a source of greater use as the community continues to evolve in a whole bunch of directions, but we have some centers of employment?
Those specific routes are not high ridership, to your point, Mel, the express routes. So to James' point earlier, we can tweak those. It's just a matter of working through this process and making sure that we're not spending, to your point, we don't want to waste resources where we don't have ridership.
But why are they not? Do we understand that?
These are some of the questions that the COA will answer. In terms of initial feedback, James, I don't know that we have initial feedback on those specific routes. Do we?
No, but they will be looking at the origin destination pairs for those to ensure that there's a on both ends of those express routes to make sure that the ridership is consistent and efficient in our distribution of resources. I believe Suntran, we can work with Suntran to get exact ridership numbers as they currently stand for the express service.
So as the community is planning, so an example is Vale or Marana or Oro Valley, we've got a lot of people planning to live in those areas. And we have some areas where there's a lot of employment or expected employment. Are we planning to have park and ride in Vale so that we can encourage those places where people will be living to use more transit? I'm not limited to that particular area, but what are we doing to plan more transit use, to encourage more where we expect more housing?
We're currently, we work with the local business community. We are always open to we're working on some service right now for a large employer. So we are absolutely looking at those things, Mel, and we'll follow up and get you those ridership numbers as well.
Okay, but yeah, I'd like to follow up in particular with the planned developments. I've talked to the people out in Vale, and they don't seem to have anything committed to plan so that we increase ridership, because we're going to have more people living there going somewhere to work.
Understood. Absolutely. We are looking at those specific suburbs as well. So we'll to you and we'll get you some of that information that you're looking for.
Thank you, Rhett, for that. I do see Mr. Dale Calvert's hand up. Dale? Dale, you're muted.
There we go. Yes, my question relates to, we've got a timeline that we're looking at with June, that the board, the RTA board wants answers as to for our recommendations by June 30th. And, when you're talking about the express service and daily services, are we better to say just improve the individual or the actual route services rather than the express services? Or should we, that's what I'm getting, is that right now we don't see any real prospects for the express services. Is it better to extend the regular route service, or is it better to work with something like the express services?
I'm just writing it down. That's a very good question. I realize we're on an expedited timeline with when you need to make recommendations, and we're working as fast as we can. Some of the items working, especially the COA, were affected by the pandemic and have just kind of pushed these things backwards. But we are working feverishly to try to get you the information you need ahead of these deadlines.
I think Farhad has some additional information to add. Farhad?
Yeah, thank you, Paki. Dale, again, as you recall, and you've seen quite a few COAs in the past, as well as I have. That document is an operational document. It's a document that guides operations over 5-10 years into the future. So what we're doing as part of the RTA process, we're not getting into the operations. We're prioritizing investments. We're setting aside buckets. Operational decisions will follow over the life of the RTA. So those decisions have to be made on annual basis. We work closely with Suntran and the city and identify efficiencies, and over the life of the RTA, those decisions are made. So those are not what we're asking this committee to really get too involved in. It's nice to have a perspective. It's nice to know how it's going to be handled, but we're not asking you to make operational recommendations.
No, that was exactly what I was struggling with, Farhad. And so what we're looking at is allocating to the various sub-elements of the transit that we can, and with really not a real clarity as to where that money would be going. That ultimately will be decided.
Prioritizing sub-elements. I'm sorry, prioritizing sub-elements is really what you're doing. And again, thanks to you and others who've been involved with transit committees over many years, it gets a lot more ongoing collaboration with the citizens committees and others and the governing bodies to make those decisions. So even if we were going to change a route, there's a process to follow, and we need to do that to make sure we're in compliance.
That's really what I wanted on the table, because yes, I've been there and we've done that over the years and worked on individual routes with the time on CAC and on the transit task force. So we're really just looking to try to fill in some ideas of what we can say about the goes into the very individual buckets, not necessarily what routes or what specific service it would go to. Am I getting that? Okay.
Exactly. Again, it helps to have the perspective. I appreciate the presentation. And if there are any other transit working group members who want to chime in and provide additional perspective, it's helpful. And as we discussed at the last subcommittee meeting, it takes X amount of money to keep doing what we're doing, and we have capacity to do more. So that's really where the conversation comes from. What do you want to do with the additional capacity to do more? Where do you want to put those dollars in prioritizing sub-elements?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Farhad, before we move on to the other transit working group members, Steve Spade did have his hand up. So Steve, I just wanted to see if you wanted to add anything more.
Well, I'm afraid I might just echo what Farhad had to say. I think that we're working at two different ends of the spectrum. The COA really takes a look at how the system's performing, gives us really good detailed information on what we're doing right, where we're not performing so well, but also gives us an idea of travel patterns. And then if you take a look at the RTA and, the Tucson planning for the route and service expansions, those things get vetted out. We can give kind of order of magnitude information if we want to talk about where we think ridership could go long term. But really, as you start developing your 5 and 10-year plans, then you can identify specific areas and you start to look at economic development that's going in there, population density, the demographics of the area, and how you link them up, and you can start making more specific projections on exact operating costs and ridership. So some of that's a work in process.
Thank you, Steve. Carolyn, I saw your hand pop up. Do you have a question, one more question for the city?
I have more than one question for the city. I just wanted to follow up on that one first, though. The COA will inform changes in specific needs regarding routes and this, that, and the other, but it sounds like from what the city was saying, it will also inform them if they need less money or more money in terms of what their proposals are thus far. If it's not in our current timeline, but is that what I heard? The COA might tell us that, especially on the heels of Mel's questions about future needs. I don't know if that'll inform us about that, but I'm really trying to follow up on getting a handle on the COA in terms of the city's proposed needs. Does that make sense?
Our costs have increased a great deal. And that, again, when you factor in inflation and these items, it's become more expensive to operate our system. So that piece of it, we're doing everything we can, obviously, to constrain costs. But items like fuel and wages are things that are going up, and it's difficult.
Okay, so another question. I think, Patrick, well, I should say you, the city, submitted those two high capacity projects in the named project category. So it sounds like that's where you would like to see them, right? Because the CAC, we were recommended that they move over to transit. And we also voted to move the budgets for them over to transit, but that hasn't happened because of the board and what we are looking at with the total of 510. So would you recommend that they go back? I think it was just those two, but back into the name projects? Or
I
something?
don't think we'd have any specific recommendation in terms of where they'd be located within the RTA next plan. The existing structure has the streetcar under the transit element, I believe.
Right.
It's fine. It was more that as the request was made to the jurisdictions with the initiation of the kind of call for projects to RTA next, it was a broader definition. It was named project. So we submitted it under that category because it met the criteria of a named project, which was a specific capital investment with defined location.
Okay, and then to Farhad, I think this is a question for you. They were talking about just the city projects. It didn't include Sunvan and shuttle. So does that money for those corresponding needs come out of the next RTA, or is that a PAG requirement that you fund with federal funding or whatever?
Sure. So I'll be happy to touch on that. So our partners over at the city, that was a good start with the city portion of RTA projects. We obviously have the data for other non-city portions of the RTA investments, and basically the data supports that we have additional capacity. So at the 510, we can continue to do what we're doing with the city. We can continue to do what we're doing with Sun Shuttle and ADA services. And there's still some capacity to take on some new investments as well. So we have capacity on the service side of the business. So we have all that information. We can provide that. We can send it out by email. So really the question becomes, that I forgot what James had on his slide. I believe it was 46% remaining that could go to Sun Shuttle and everything else, and potentially new services. That sounds about right, and we'll share that information. So really the question at this point becomes on capital investments. So services, I think we're in a good shape. We have capacity. Capital investments, that's a decision to be made. A recommendation can be made to have named capital investments. And I wouldn't worry about where we put it, but let's identify if that's something we want to include.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, I was just saying that we could, if it was included over there, then there's more money in the named projects, even though we're already a little over. So, okay, that's all.
Thank you.
Okay, no, Carolyn, I was just going to say, James had his hand up for a while, so I didn't know if you wanted to address something you had mentioned earlier. James?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Carolyn. Thank you for your question. So just to address the concern you had about the COA, the baseline draft recommendations for the COA will be cost neutral. So looking at existing expenditures and kind of shuffling them on where it makes sense, getting rid of inefficiencies and putting that money elsewhere. We have also asked them for beyond a cost neutral for desperately services to let us know what those costs would be in the event we have additional funding to help support those initiatives. So cost neutral as a basis, but then looking for additional improvements as kind of guided by the COA.
Okay, super helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Steve?
Yeah, pardon me for maybe asking a silly question, but I thought that the projections that James made looking at RTA were suggesting that there's not enough money in RTA next to maintain current service levels long-term. Now, that assumption seems to be different than what I was just hearing a minute ago. So I guess I'm just asking for some clarification, because I thought there wasn't enough funding.
Yes. So my understanding of the table that you all provided and our analysis is that we have capacity to continue the services that we currently provide. And James, please correct me. I was looking at your slide that roughly $200 million is to continue, right?
Correct. So we did do that analysis showing in current $24. I would add, though, that we did have an additional considerations looking at the cost for ongoing streetcar maintenance and repairs as they are approaching their midlife, being in need of substantial rehabilitation funds. Additionally, we had an optional approach where we looked at inflation and include that, and that was a different look. We found that the current operating costs are outpacing our revenues in. So if the committee would like an alternate approach where we took inflation into account and looked at it that way, and it gave a different result.
So let me make sure everybody's clear on the inflation discussion. So basically the revenue side of the equation assumes revenue over the next 20 years and obviously increased revenue over the next 20 years. And then we deflate that revenue back to 2020 dollars for the sake of being able to compare, right? So we compare the cost in 2020 with 2022, compare the cost and the revenue, and that's what we're doing currently. Over the life of the plan, everybody acknowledges that not only cost will increase, but also revenue collections will increase. Are they going to be to the same amount? That's unknown. So that has to be determined annually on an annual basis. The RTA board develops a budget on an annual basis, and then they try to have a balanced budget to accommodate that cost increase. So it's apples and oranges if we try to compare cost increases over 20 years with a nominal 2022 revenue. To balance it out, you can look at potential revenue increases as well, but then at that point, we're just forecasting. So it's best to look at 2022 dollars, compare cost versus revenue, and anticipate that there's increases on both sides of the equation.
Steve, did you have another follow-up question to that?
Yeah, I guess just an editorial comment that, at least in my experience in transit, when 100% of your operating expenses grow by 6%, if you're only generating 40% of your revenue through another source, it has to grow by twice as much to keep up, and that makes it kind of a challenge. And that's why that's why we were trying to look at inflationary increases.
Thanks for explaining that, Steve. Before we move into the meat of today's meeting, which is the discussion on the element, sub-element allocations, I wanted to give the other transit working group members an opportunity to chime in on this discussion. Do any of the other transit working group members have any information that they'd like to provide the subcommittee or anything to add? I don't see any hands. Right, Rhett, since you're my co-facilitator? Just kidding. Yeah. This screen's a little bit difficult to monitor. Okay.
Carolyn's.
Carolyn.
Yeah, Carolyn's got her hand up.
Saw her.
It's just me again. No, I was just Oro Valley, Paul at our meeting had mentioned about, maybe it wasn't our meeting, but at a meeting was mentioning that Oro Valley was really interested in having more transit going up and down I think the Oracle corridor, or maybe even La Cañada or whatever. But I was wondering if they had any particular, Oro Valley that is. I see Amy, I don't know if anybody else is on here from Oro Valley, but was there anything specific that Oro Valley had, well, Moran on here too, but had to suggest and propose in terms of transit that the city wasn't suggesting? That's just a question. Thanks.
Farhad?
So I can answer that, and Amy, if you're willing to chime in, please do. So again, goes back to the submittal process. Named projects, we requested all entities to submit named projects, and Oro Valley did not submit any named capital transportation or transit projects. Amy, do you, off the top of your head, you know that you guys are having that discussion?
I do not. I have not been aware that Paul had that request to ask for a transit project. I do know that over a year ago we submitted some stuff, but it wasn't for service along Oracle. And honestly, Carolyn, the reason we wouldn't probably be doing that is we operate the local service. We would, and we do rely on even these COAs as they look the propensity for transit outside their jurisdiction. That would be expresses and other things. And if we were going to go that way, we'd rely on sort of Sun Transit big boys to operate that. But I am unaware of transit requests in that we did not put anything on. So I will be following up on that.
Yeah, let me just clarify. He didn't make any specific requests. He just said Oro Valley was very supportive of transit. So you probably answered that question in terms of Sun Transit. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands, so we'll go ahead and move forward with the next agenda item, which is the review and discussion of the recommended transit element and potential sub-element allocations for the RTA Next draft plan. Crystal, are you controlling or am I? Oh, there we go. Okay. And again, we have our team here that I mentioned earlier to chime in and add any information. Okay, so just as a refresher, the transit sub-elements, these are considered to be descriptive budget items. The RTA board, as you all know, will implement the transit sub-elements based on detailed studies of needs and updated information at the time of the implementation. The RTA's transit element is to enhance existing services or to fill in any gaps. And supplementation is not allowed by RTA laws. Fleet replacement, for example, is a non-RTA route or service area, and it's not the RTA's responsibility. Because that would be considered supplementation. So this is the little pie chart that you've all seen several times. We just wanted to put it back up. This is the maintenance and operation, adopted sub-element allocations. The current sub-elements that this subcommittee approved.
Jose is currently unavailable.
Back a few years ago was weekend service of 10%, weekday evening service is 15%, express service 5%, neighborhood circulator 15%, frequency is 17%, area expansion 7%, and special needs 31%. And the percentages we're talking about is out of the $510 million that the board has allocated for this element. Here is that allocation chart that you've all seen. This shows each of the sub-elements that I just mentioned and the adopted allocation and the current funding allocation. So again, if you look at the middle column, that's the RTA board allocation of $510 million. And then the current funding allocation that we have now is $370.7 million. So the next step is for the subcommittee to discuss these sub-elements, and I'll go back to the chart, so that you can determine what you would like to recommend to the full CAC and move forward. So unless there are any questions, I'll go ahead and open the discussion. Farhad, I see your hand up.
Yeah, again, just as a follow-up to a previous question. So looking at the chart, as we've discussed before, currently we anticipate what you see on the right-hand column as far as investments in each sub-element. And then the middle column is what was proposed previously by the subcommittee as percentages. Now that we have the 510, we're using that as a breakdown. And we'll be happy to go line item by line item, but based on our calculation, based on the information that was just provided by the city, at least for the first one, we believe the 76.5 is sufficient to continue doing what we're doing and continue to enhance. So if you don't mind, I recommend just going line item by line item and have that discussion if anybody has any questions on the first one.
Yes, I have a question based upon the earlier question that what do we expect or anticipate in return for these investments? Again, I'm very struck by express service having almost no increase. And I don't know the numbers that will be increased by weekend service or weekday evening. Very large increases. And I don't have the faintest idea that for X dollars, we'll get some percentage increase or improvement. So I'm not happy voting for sub-elements without any better knowledge.
Paki, if I may, and then this is where hopefully Steve and Rhett or James like to chime in again. So to my knowledge, let's look at one item at a time so we can focus the conversation. So when we're talking about extending evening hours during weekdays, to my knowledge, other than having a pilot project to demonstrate if you are increasing ridership on a specific route, there's no other projection per se. So nobody can answer that question by saying, well, if I increase evening hours on this route, I'm going to get so many more ridership. So in reality, you can do a pilot project for 6 months or 12 months, analyze it, and then you make a decision beyond that point if you want to continue that investment or not. It's very difficult to answer that question without actually putting it to work. I see Steve's hand up.
Yeah, just to share on that comment, I agree that it's hard to come up with hard numbers. We can say, though, that if services are more urban in nature, where you have a higher population density, you've got more employment, you got different demographics, that you're going to see higher passengers per revenue mile than you might see in, say, regional express service or feeder service, just by the nature of the travel demands and travel habits of people that live in the less populated areas. So generally, if you look at your transit service ridership, the heaviest ridership's in the core, and the farther out you move, then the lower your passengers per revenue are. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that you have to look at them a little bit differently.
Thank you, Steve. Tom's hand was up. Tom?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that I understood the current funding allocation, that each of them, the total of 370 million, that's just based on how much we're projected to have spent by the end of 2026, not what was originally anticipated for funding from RTA 1. Is that correct?
That is correct. 370 for transit services.
Okay.
For the services you see listed here.
All right. So whatever enhancements these bought us, we can go beyond this amount now, is what you're saying.
Yes, again, if you recall, we do anticipate capacity to take on new enhancements, but based on our current projections, we believe that roughly, again, I don't want to speak off the top of my head on that, but we do believe there is capacity for new services over the life of the program. So this is the closest you get to that number. 370 appears to be current investments, and the balance would be new investments.
Okay.
Okay, Tom, thanks. And Dale, I see your hand up.
Yes. I think it's under the circumstances of where we're at, this basic recommendation here, I think I can live with. I think from a long-term standpoint, and as long as we're living with a $510 million allocation, I think this is about as good as we're going to do with the pots of money that are going to be settled in the future as to how they're used. My only concern here is about the funds for the and I'm drawing a blank on this, on the term I'm looking for here, for the high capacity systems is what I was talking about. And if we're going to throw the high capacity systems back into the other pool, that pool is for the specific projects, and we're not going to allocate something here for it. I think there's very high probability that high capacity doesn't get funded at all. And I think the committee needs to think about that and whether we want to include the high capacity here, even though that it's a specific type of project, or whether we want to throw it back into that other pool where we already know we're like $300 million over, and we're going to have to cut projects to get down even to 300 million, let alone to add the high capacity. But given the fact that we're working with pools and not specific services, I am comfortable with this, with a $510 million allocation. I think a whole lot of people have indicated they're not comfortable with the $510 million calculation or budget, but I think that's a discussion that has to be dealt with from the board standpoint. And if they're going to stick with the 510, I think this is about the best as we can do.
Thanks, Dale. I wanted to remind the group that there's only one named project that was discussed by the CAC to be possibly put into this element, and that was the Ronstadt Transit Center to the airport. There isn't more than one that was discussed. The other one that the city mentioned was not one that was a priority of the CACs. So just to mention that, but that's a separate discussion for this exercise today. We wanted the subcommittee to take a look at, these adopted allocations, and then as Farhad explained to Tom what the current funding allocations are, and to go through each one to see, do you agree that $76.5 million will go for week, will be, is the correct allocation for weekday evening bus service, $51 million for weekend bus service, $86.7 million for bus frequency, $158 million for the special needs transit, $76.5 million for the neighborhood circulator bus systems, 25.5, and this is the only sub-element that did have a slight decrease, was the express service, and then $35.7 million for service area expansion. Tom, I see that your hand is still up. I didn't know if you had another thought previously, or did you forget to take it down?
Yeah, sorry, I had to step away real quick, and I didn't take it down.
Okay, no worries. Farhad, did you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was not, I was muted. Thank you again for that. So Dale, appreciate your comment. That's really, I think, the best path forward to at least get the ball moving forward. And then I would even suggest that nothing is finalized until it's finalized. So there's opportunity to make adjustments. But to really move the conversation forward, we recommend for the committee to approve these amounts, and then we'll obviously recognize that you can adjust later as other decisions are made.
Carolyn, I see your hand up.
Yes, a couple of questions following up on yours, Paki, about the high capacity transit. And I could probably look this up, but as far as the named projects, it would be good to look back at the city's list and find out where those two projects came in from as their priorities. Compared to all their other named project priorities. I don't know if anybody can answer that right now, because I can look at it later, and then we can deal with those two particular projects. I guess that's a question, then I'll pause. Do you know, city people, where did those come in your overall priorities for named projects?
Those high priority projects, Carolyn, obviously high capacity has been a focus for our leadership And so it's important to us that they go into RTA next.
Okay. Okay. Well, like I said, I'll look at our, because we went through that ranking process that looked at your rankings and TMC rankings, but I will go do my homework. But the other question, which relates to what I was asking of Oro Valley and Marana, the neighborhood circulator bus systems, where did that number come from? Is that a priority for other jurisdictions, or is that a priority for Suntran didn't put them in, but city would have. So where did that number come from for the circulator bus systems?
So if you recall, when the subcommittee met last and discussed this in terms of percentages, we were looking at the long-range plan. The transit long-range plan identified neighborhood circulators for areas that do not have any transit services as a priority. So Vail, for example, we just talked about Vail. So if there's an opportunity to start a neighborhood circulator in the Vail area, and then over time monitor ridership and monitor if they're using the neighborhood circulator to connect to a fixed route, then obviously those are kind of starter investments. And if we can make those connections to fixed routes, then over time that benefits the fixed route as well. So the one in Marana has been successful. The ones in Oro Valley and Sahuarita have been successful. So again, it's following recommendations of the long-range transit plan to invest more in those circulators.
Understand. I guess my question was just about, we heard from the people in Vail that wasn't a request, or in the Green Valley folks, that wasn't a request, and keeping the current funding allocation of 45, that's like a 40% increase. And you're saying, Farhad, that came from kind of an expectation from the long range transit plan?
Yep, the long range transit plan, if you recall at the last meeting, we discussed that there were 4 different initiatives that were recommended. Neighborhood circulators were one of those recommendations. And again, it really goes back to over the next 20 years, if you have areas that have no transit, that is really their only option. If people who rely on transit will not have any other form of transit unless we start with these neighborhood circulators. So it's a good opportunity to introduce them to transit and make the connections to the fixed routes. And again, last time this committee had that discussion, they believed it was a priority. That's why they assigned that percentages to it.
Okay, so the COA is not going to be able to tell us anything about that because we don't have that.
Yeah.
Right.
Again, so if you look at identifying new service areas, I touched on it earlier, and I invite all the colleagues to chime in if they like. But new service areas, obviously, you want to make sure that you give yourself a pilot period, try it out 6 months, 12 months. And if it's successful, that's great. You continue that investment. If not, it's part of the process. The process would say, we are going to do this neighborhood circulator for 12 months. And if it works out, we'll come back and continue that investment. That is really the only way, in my opinion, or in my experience, to analyze if we're able to successfully increase ridership in areas that currently don't have transit.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand. It's just that if the COA will tell us if people are riding.
The COA is only looking at the current services. So another way of looking at the COA is really you take your bicycle in for a tune-up. So they'll take a look at it. They make some recommendations. Maybe get a new chain, maybe change your tire. They make some recommendations. Ultimately, we all have to make those decisions, which recommendations we're going to implement. And the goal is to tune up the system, right? We want the best and most efficient system with a reasonable cost. The COA doesn't get into planning. It is purely operational. Planning is done by the long range plan.
Yeah, no, understand. what I meant by the COA was that they would tell us if people are using transit from those suburban areas in the first place, but you're saying that if we add these things, they're going to start using it. I mean, it's
So we've had surveys, and we're going to continue to conduct surveys as part of the transit planning aspect of our PAG. And those surveys are a good indicator of where there might be some demand and if people might use transit if a service was offered. So that's where the long range plan came back from. Long range plan conducted those surveys and came back with responses that people would use transit in these areas if there was a transit option.
Okay, well, I just, to Dale's point that he's fine with this, that would be good to know, because as I recall it in the long range transit plan, these other investments were more of a priority. But anyway, that's what I'm just answering Dale. I don't know if I'm totally comfortable with these allocations at this point, or even ready to, that this was, we
Okay.
voted on it a long time ago before the pandemic as well. But anyway, that's all.
I see Steve Spade's hand was up. So Steve, did you want to add more to that conversation?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the COA, while it is measuring the performance of the existing system, it's going to give us an opportunity to test a few things that we've done. We've, for instance, implemented urban circulators in an effort to augment ridership. We'll be able to see how the performance of the on-demand service in those two zones has helped, expand ridership. And I think so some of that may fit into the neighborhood circulator system. And I think Farhad's exactly right also. You may get into other areas, say Marana or Vale, and find that when you look at the population, there may be more demand for some of those circulator services than potentially express service. And so I think as you get into the planning phase, you can start to measure some of those things. And if you've got some flexibility between your sub-elements, that if planning does show that there's a change in priorities, you're able to move the funding to meet the changing demands of the public, you're even better off.
Thanks, Steve. Mel?
Yes. Current funding, how many people are using the neighborhood circulator for $45 million?
Do we have that?
Well, if Amy's online, we can use Oro Valley as an example. They are doing a great job, and they are probably one of the highest user circulators. Amy, are you still on? Oh, Amy's not on anymore.
So my point is, I'd like to know, I mean, for every rider that's getting weekend evening, we're paying, how many dollars are we paying? And the same thing for any of these. I'd like to know, because it may not be worth the investment to double some of these numbers if we're, if the ridership numbers are more expensive than other alternatives.
Fahad, I'm sorry, I didn't know how to unmute myself.
Oh, good, you're on. So if you heard the question, again, the question was, are these neighborhood circulators efficient? Are they adding benefit? Obviously, my response is yes, but anything you can add, please do.
Yeah, so in my opinion, the dial-a rides that we offer, these neighborhood circulators, are the only way to offer service in the Vale, Oro Valley, Marana area. We don't have the densities the city of Tucson does. We have a different population base, and you need to get out into there and running. We tried a fixed route with the first go around. That did not work. Not enough people could ride. Our service is through the roof right now. We have riders, and the biggest population are, of course, the ADA plus the seniors. They're riding this, and this is their only form of access to doctors and to mobility. But you can't run a fixed route down Rancho Vistoso, for instance. You can't run a fixed route during some of these little areas. There's just not the density that you have along Broadway, that you have along Speedway, and they'll never make it. Are they more expensive than fixed route? Yes, but it's a service. And if we want to expand into those areas with that expansion phase, then you're going to have to offer these services.
But my question is, how many people are currently using them? What's it costing per rider?
So
I can go ahead and answer that question from the Sun Shuttle perspective. We're reaching across a couple of different communities. So I'm speaking specifically about Sun Shuttle services to Marana, Oro Valley, the San Javier district of Tohono O'odham Nation, Tucson Estates, Valencia West, Drexel Heights, and a couple of other communities, including 2 general public dial-a-ride areas serving Avra Valley and Green Valley, and the Ajo services. We're seeing about 15 to 16K riders a month. And so that's our ridership, monthly ridership numbers.
And I do want to piggyback on what Amy was mentioning there. These are lower density areas. You're not going to find the same ridership as you would with a service that's inside city limits, but these are lifeline services for people out there. They have no other options, no other alternatives in terms of public transportation if they don't have access to a vehicle or someone who owns a vehicle on a regular basis. If they need to make doctor's appointments, if they need to get their groceries, this is pretty much it. Or if they need to connect into the city, this is all they have. And so, even though we're seeing, 15,000, 16,000 trips on average a month, these are people who desperately rely on this service. So it's hard to compare that to, ridership that you would see in the city. But I did want to, agree with Amy on her statement.
Yeah, we judge Sun Shuttle by a little different metrics than SunTran for those reasons.
Amy, I think you got cut off a little bit. Were you going to say something else about that?
No, I think that's all that's said. It will not produce the passenger per hour, like I said, a Route 8 is. They're different type services, and I think what we have to figure out as a community, are these the services we want to provide? And there's a lot of want, there's a lot of desire. There are people that are trapped in their homes weekdays because they don't have weekend services. So like I said, this is the first time I've seen this list, but I'm going to delve into it a little bit and think.
Thank you, Amy. Steve, I see your hand went up.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo what Amy and Rio are saying. The demographics of those communities are totally different, and the way you evaluate services are totally different. And while the numbers are different, obviously, it's really important to provide service to everybody in the community. It's a matter of understanding that and then making sure that we're not comparing apples to oranges all the time.
Thank you, Steve. Tom?
I just didn't want to sound anti-regional, Amy. So.
Oh. Thank you, Steve.
Not a problem.
Appreciate it. Tom?
Yeah, thanks. I thought maybe I'd go back to the chart and mention something to the committee. I was just looking at, these are the numbers on the right were kind of the result of the board having to divert some of of what became available, frankly, for them after the Great Recession for the amount that was originally allocated. But looking at how it was used, I can see that there are some slight changes. Those top 3 service areas, total 42% based on the allocations that that this committee recommended a couple of years ago. and what is shown there on the screen. Whereas the actual funding, the current funding, comes out to about 40%. So pretty much the same, but each of them is jiggered a little bit differently. Like the weekend jumps from 6.5% to 10%. The weekday and evening service goes from 11.6 to 15. Those are the kind of the basics of, I think, what probably carried the transit element in the original RTA. So, those and frequency were really important. We did end up spending 21.5%, or will have spent that for the frequency, and we've got 17% allocated here. Overall, I think those look good. It shows that the operators had to kind of take the money they had, put it where they could get the most out of it, and the result was fairly close to what is being proposed here. So I feel fairly good about that. The special needs remains flat, basically the same percentage, 31 versus 32. The circulators do go up a little, but not as much as I kind of thought by just looking at the numbers. And as Mel was talking about, it goes from having spent 12.3% up to 15%. Remembering that if we do any enhancements of further enhancements, those will probably be the areas where we'll be triggering that expansion of the service area, and having to do that along with the special needs. And then finally, the express does drop down from 7 to 5%. But based on the things that we've heard, that sounds reasonable to me. And then the service area expansion, whereas it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys, but it seems like service area expansion is covered in some other areas, at least indirectly as well. But that one is 8.5% versus 7%. So overall, I'm still not seeing big issues with the percentages as they've been shown. I think there'll be members of probably this subcommittee and maybe the CAC as well who wish or hope or want to hold out for a larger pie. But overall, if we got the kind of enhancements that we were able to, despite the loss of overall revenues that we're seeing there at the $371 million total, I think indeed there appears that there is going to be some room for fairly good enhancement. So anyway, that was my point. I'm I guess supporting the percentages as they are as a place to move forward from.
Thank you for going over those, Tom. Dale, your hand's been up for a while.
Yes, it has. I wanted to make a couple of comments. Carolyn and Mel, I hear what you're saying, but as long as we're dealing with POTS and without specific services, it's hard to come up with those kind of numbers. And I'd like to make a comment also about the circulators. And I'm going to draw, as a former operator of a public utility water system, which is, we're talking about public utilities here, and the outlying services are always more expensive to provide and do not justify themselves in the overall, except that those people that you get out there on that outside service supplement the basic system and are a part of your meeting your central costs, etc. So, as a practical matter, whether you're talking about a bus system or a transit system, or talking about a water system or a gas system, these kind of characteristics of the outlying never cover the cost the way the centric does, is endemic. Now, when you're operating a water system, you have a franchised area that you're covering, and the state says you got to serve anybody within that system who wants water. But which is a little different than here. But I think you got to recognize when you're talking about something like a neighborhood circulator, you're talking about a lower density area, and it's going to be simply higher to provide service to those areas. So I support that logic, and I still am saying with the level at which we are doing this, and I would love to be at a different level, but at the level we're doing this, I think this is about as good an allocation as we can get. So we go from there.
Thank you, Dale. Thanks. Farhad?
Thank you. I think both Tom and Dell summarized what I was going to add, so I really don't have much more to add other than, again, I hope you all acknowledge that ultimately public transportation is important to the RTA. We hope that we can continue to invest, obviously at the level that's shown right now. But those decisions are made over the life of the plan by our board and our partners. And I can tell you, having worked with all the partners over the last 17 years of RTA planning process, those decisions are made mindfully, thoughtfully, and with the hope that we're providing the best and most efficient services that we can provide. I'm proud of our folks at Suntran, Oro Valley, Morano, you name it. Every single person that comes to the table, they come to the table to serve, and all these decisions have been made as a team. And we believe that we have one of the best transit systems in the country as a region. So with that, I really ask you to please consider approving this so we can move the conversation forward, and keep in mind that adjustments could be made further on down the road as needed.
Thank you. There's one more hand up, Mel. Mel, maybe not.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a problem that the city has identified 2 routes are very important, and we've only included one, and not having it in this transit is a mistake. I mean, it needs, both of them need to be there, and we have not provided that.
Carolyn?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Mel, but I would love to get Farhad, your response on those 2 projects, because as the city said, they are high priority. So where do you think they belong, and how do we deal with that in this? And the other couple of comments I have is, I mean, I totally agree with the neighborhood circulator bus systems being able to provide service for people that need it. And I mean, I am pro-transit no matter, I mean, the more transit, the better. It's just that we've been dealt a hand of 510 million, which we're being asked to make choices. But the one thing I will propose, and I proposed this before, Paki and Farhad, is that instead of putting the adopted allocations as our numbers that we would approve, can we put percentages of the total budget instead? Because a majority of our committee has questioned the need for wanting to have more money for categoricals. So asking the board to perhaps up the sales tax. I mean, that's totally up to the board, obviously, but a percentage, if we could adopt these on the slide, the percentages as opposed to the numbers, I think I could support that.
So if I may, this committee already approved these percentages. You've already acted on it. You've approved these percentages. The dollars only came into play after the 510 was identified as the size of the bucket. So we don't need an action on the percentages. We wanted an action on the dollar amounts, just to keep the conversation going forward. Again, we've had this meeting with the subcommittee multiple times. I believe that again, it's helpful to have that conversation at this subcommittee level, but I think we owe it to the larger committee to have the conversation with the larger committee and continue that conversation. Same thing along capital investments. That's a conversation that even the larger committee hopefully would benefit from being part of that to make that decision if they want to move it under named projects or keep it under transit. So my recommendation is to please approve this so we can have that conversation with the full committee, and we can put the percentages next to it, but that's where these numbers came from.
No, understand. I was just suggesting that because the larger committee had talked about needing more money, it seems like it would be more appropriate to just forward the percentages.
Again, it translates to these dollar amounts. We can have the same conversation with the full committee. Again, if you recall from my memo that I sent earlier, we all acknowledge that we wish to have more than $2.3 billion. That's another challenge. So we need to have that conversation, that larger context. I don't think this subcommittee is going to be able to get us there unless you move this forward to the full committee.
Hockey?
Yes, Dale.
It's Tom, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. I saw Dale's hand up earlier, so I thought it was him. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, has there been a motion made by the subcommittee yet on this question?
There has not. I was just about to request that. So if you have one.
Yeah, I would move that we take this, both the pie chart and this chart here to the full committee as our recommended starting point, and that we put the percentages in both columns. That is, we put the percentages that have been previously approved and come from the pie chart, and then for reference, so people get an idea, because the difference between 370 and 510 is very significant. And if you have the percentages next to it, it makes it easier to see what decisions were made and have been made, throughout, as well as how close this is really to what the operators and the public felt was the most important of those elements and the most expensive, if you will. So I think it just helps the conversation if we bring that next slide in with the numbers shown and the percentages of each in parentheses. So that was my motion.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Do we have a second on that motion? Diane?
I will second the motion, and then can we have a discussion?
Yes.
All right, I'd like to just, if we are to bring this back to the larger committee, there has been a request made to update our language, specifically the element of this element that says special needs transit for elderly and disabled citizens. One possible suggestion, and I don't know if we're going to forward this, if this is the time to mention this, but something along the lines of enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities. Same number of words, but updated language.
That's a friendly amendment to Tom. Tom, accept that?
Yeah, that's acceptable to me.
All right. So Diane, your friendly amendment is accepted.
Okay.
All right.
Discussion here. I just wanted to remind you, the committee, that 370.7 million is what the current funding allocation, but as you know, what was on the ballot was almost 534 million, which of course included the streetcar. So I will make a substitute motion to just continue on with the pie chart and add a request to the board, and to ask for more feedback from the TMC, that we need more funding, overall funding in this category.
All right, sounds like we don't have a second on the substitute motion, so
Okay.
let's call for the vote, Pocky. So we have a motion and a second. Motion was amended. Let's call for the vote, please.
Okay. I'll just go down the line here. So Carolyn,
No.
Diane,
Abstain.
Tom,
Yes.
Dale, Dale, are you there? Okay, Mel,
Nope.
and I believe Arlen's gone, right? Arlen.
So do we still have a quorum then, I hope?
Yeah, we have an exact quorum.
Ah,
Well, it looks like you lost Dale, so
Oh,
Okay.
no, Dale is gone now. Sorry, I
Yeah.
thought I saw him on the other list. We
yeah,
have
you
two
only
lists.
have four. Yeah, you only have four people. We don't even have a quorum.
Oh, no, we did lose Dale. I didn't realize, Dale usually tells me when he leaves, so we don't have quorum now.
All right, we need to adjourn the meeting, so that motion and the second doesn't count since we didn't even have a quorum.
Okay, he was here during the discussion, but yeah, we'll adjourn now. Thank you, everybody.
thank you.